Welcome, history enthusiasts. Step into a world where legends come alive, where the icy expanses of the Arctic hide secrets that even the fiercest Viking warriors feared, and where one remarkable tribe shaped history in ways that still echo through time. Today, we journey into the mysterious lands of the Sami, the only tribe that terrified the Vikings to their core. Prepare to uncover tales of survival, cunning, and spiritual mastery as we explore their untold stories, legendary encounters, and enduring legacy. From ghostly ambushes in frozen forests to strategies that outsmarted the most formidable warriors of the North, this is a story of intelligence, resilience, and the true power of human adaptability. So grab a warm cup, settle in, and let's travel together into the chilling yet awe-inspiring world of the Sami. Your journey into history begins now. History has always been shaped by those who dare to confront the unknown, by those whose courage sets them apart from ordinary men, and yet, sometimes even the most fearless warriors are forced to reckon with a force greater than their strength or experience. Among the many stories of legendary warriors, brutal raids, and conquests that echo through time, few are as fascinating or as chilling as the story of the Vikings. The Vikings, known as the Northmen, were invaders, explorers, traders, and raiders whose reputations spread like wildfire across Europe during the early medieval period. From the frozen fjords of Scandinavia to the verdant forests and rivers of the British Isles and mainland Europe, their longships cut through the waters like blades, and their warriors, clad in furs and iron, instilled terror wherever they traveled. To many, the very mention of a Viking conjures images of relentless raids, fiery villages, and communities trembling in fear, expecting no mercy from these formidable seafarers. They were known for their strength, their ferocity in battle, and their cunning strategies that allowed them to strike swiftly and vanish just as quickly into the forests or back across the sea. In a time when law and order were fragile and kingdoms were often at the mercy of more powerful forces, the Vikings represented the ultimate threat. And yet, within the annals of history, there exists a fascinating paradox, a tribe unyielding and mysterious, whose presence alone could make even these legendary warriors hesitate, a tribe that struck fear into the hearts of the Northmen in ways that no other people could. The Vikings, who were accustomed to facing armies, fortresses, and fierce warriors, encountered a force they could not simply overpower with numbers or strength, a force that defied their understanding and challenged their reputation as invincible conquerors. This was not a mere tribe. It was the Sami people, the original inhabitants of the Arctic and subarctic regions of Scandinavia, whose story is interwoven with mystery, resilience, and an almost otherworldly connection to the land they called home. The Vikings, as we know, were remarkable not just for their physical prowess, but for their relentless ambition and adaptability. They could raid the coasts of England one season and traverse rivers deep into France or Russia the next, leaving a trail of destruction that would be recounted for generations. Their longships, engineered with precision and speed, allowed them to navigate shallow rivers and open seas alike, giving them an advantage that few could match. And yet, the Vikings were also a superstitious people. Though they worshipped gods of thunder, war, and fertility, Odin, Thor, Freyja, they were wary of the unknown, the invisible forces of the world, and anything that lay beyond their understanding. They believed in omens, in spirits, and in magic, and they respected, or feared, those who seemed to wield powers beyond the ordinary. It was this fear of the unknown that would shape their encounters with the Sami, whose way of life was so different, so enigmatic, that it transcended the Vikings' ability to predict, control, or dominate. The Sami people, often referred to as Lapps in historical texts or Sami in modern terminology, inhabited regions that stretched across what is today northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and parts of Russia. Their lands were not the fertile plains or forested lowlands that Vikings were familiar with. These were harsh, frozen landscapes, vast expanses of tundra, snow-covered forests, and icy rivers that could kill an unprepared traveler. Survival in this environment required skills and knowledge that could seem almost magical to outsiders. The Sami moved with an intimate understanding of their surroundings, knowing the subtle shifts in weather, the hidden paths that could lead to shelter or food, and the behavior of animals that provided sustenance. They were reindeer herders, hunters, and fishermen, and their existence depended on harmony with the natural world rather than conquest or domination over it. For the Vikings, whose experience was largely based on raiding, trading, and fighting in familiar environments, the Sami represented not only a physical challenge, but an existential one. The frozen north was a place where the rules of survival were different, where the elements themselves could be turned against the unprepared, and the Sami were masters of these rules. What made the Sami especially formidable in the eyes of the Vikings was not just their ability to survive in such a harsh climate, but the aura of mystery that surrounded them. The Vikings were storytellers as much as they were warriors, and their sagas recount encounters with peoples and phenomena that defied explanation. The Sami's knowledge of the land, their techniques for tracking and hunting, and their intimate understanding of the snow and ice were all things that seemed almost supernatural. But beyond practical skills, the Sami were also deeply spiritual people, with beliefs and practices that the Vikings found unsettling. They had shamans, known as nomadictribes, who could perform rituals, communicate with spirits, and influence natural events. Whether it was calling upon the spirits of the animals they hunted, invoking protective forces, or performing ceremonies that seemed to manipulate the weather itself, the Sami's spiritual practices added a layer of fear that the Vikings could not rationalize or combat with swords and shields. In a society where magic and the supernatural were both revered and feared, the Vikings quickly learned that the Sami were a force to be respected or avoided. The first encounters between Vikings and Sami were likely driven by curiosity, trade, or the Vikings' insatiable desire for new lands to raid. Yet, these encounters often ended in retreat, not because the Vikings were defeated in battle, but because the Sami's mastery of the terrain, combined with their unconventional tactics and seemingly mystical powers, made confrontation a dangerous gamble. The Sami did not fight like the Vikings, charging in with brute force or forming traditional battle lines. They used ambushes, knowledge of the land, and psychological tactics to disorient and intimidate their enemies. Snowstorms that appeared suddenly, treacherous ice that claimed the unwary, and warriors who seemed to vanish into the blinding white landscape gave the impression of ghostly powers. Stories emerged of Vikings being driven back by the Sami without a single sword drawn, leaving them in awe and terror of a people whose methods were beyond their comprehension. To the Vikings, who prided themselves on bravery and dominance, this was a humbling and frightening experience. Over time, the reputation of the Sami grew among the Norse communities. Tales circulated of villages that could never be conquered, of hunters who could track a Viking across miles of frozen tundra and strike with deadly precision, and of shamans who could curse their enemies or summon storms. These stories spread not just as cautionary tales, but as legends that reinforced the aura of fear surrounding the Sami. They became, in the minds of the Vikings, the ghosts of the North, a people whose very presence was enough to give pause to even the most hardened warriors. This fear was not irrational. It was born of repeated experiences, of encounters in which the Vikings found themselves at a disadvantage in ways they had never imagined. The Sami were not an empire to conquer. They were a force of nature, intertwined with the harsh environment they called home, and no amount of Viking ferocity could overcome that natural advantage. The Vikings' fear of the Sami was compounded by the cultural differences between the two peoples. The Sami lived in small, mobile communities, moving with the seasons, following the herds of reindeer that were central to their survival. Their homes were simple, often temporary structures that could be dismantled and moved with the changing environment. They were skilled craftsmen, creating tools, clothing, and shelters perfectly suited to the extreme conditions of the north. They had no need for castles, armies, or the accumulation of wealth in the way that Viking societies did. To the Vikings, whose society placed immense value on conquest, treasure, and glory, this way of life was alien and incomprehensible. The Sami's independence, self-sufficiency, and ability to thrive in conditions that would have crushed others created a sense of unease and respect, a recognition that they were not ordinary adversaries, but a people whose lives were governed by principles and knowledge far beyond the Vikings' understanding. It is in this context that we begin to understand why the Sami were able to terrify the Vikings in a way that few other peoples could. The combination of their intimate knowledge of the land, their unconventional warfare, and their spiritual practices created a multifaceted defense that was almost impossible to penetrate. For the Vikings, who were accustomed to measuring strength in terms of swords, shields, and numbers, the Sami represented a different kind of power, one rooted in intelligence, adaptability, and the mysterious forces of nature. It was not merely a fear of physical harm. It was a fear of the unknown, a recognition that there were limits to their control, limits to their understanding, and limits to the dominance that had made them legendary throughout Europe. Even as time passed and the Viking Age drew to a close, the legend of the Sami persisted. Their reputation as the people who could stand against the Northmen became part of the larger narrative of Viking history, a reminder that courage and strength, no matter how formidable, are sometimes tested not by sheer force but by resilience, ingenuity, and an unbreakable connection to one's homeland. The Sami, in their frozen territories, embodied these qualities fully, becoming symbols of resistance and mystery. Their story challenges the common perception of the Vikings as invincible, revealing that even the greatest warriors could encounter opponents who were unconquerable not because of the weapons they wielded, but because of the knowledge, strategy, and unity that defined their existence. As we reflect on this fascinating historical encounter, it becomes clear that the story of the Sami and the Vikings is not merely a tale of fear and intimidation. It is a story about the power of understanding, the importance of adaptability, and the enduring influence of a people who, by living in harmony with their environment and embracing the mysteries of life, created a legacy that inspired awe even among history's most feared warriors. The Vikings may have struck terror across Europe, but the Sami, the masters of the northern wilderness, proved that true power often lies not in brute force, but in wisdom, resilience, and the courage to thrive where others fear to tread. The Sami people, whose story intertwines with the harsh and unforgiving landscapes of northern Scandinavia, have long fascinated historians, adventurers, and storytellers alike. While many think of the Vikings as the undisputed masters of the North, there existed a land so remote, so extreme, that even these seasoned raiders approached it with caution, uncertainty, and a healthy dose of fear. This land, stretching across the northern reaches of what is now Norway, Sweden, Finland, and parts of northwestern Russia, was home to the Sami, a resilient people whose lives were dictated not by conquest, wealth, or the spoils of war, but by survival, harmony with nature, and a profound understanding of the elements that shaped their existence. The Sami's mastery over their environment, coupled with their fierce independence and mysterious spiritual practices, made them an enigma to outsiders and, in particular, to the Vikings, whose reputation for fearlessness often preceded them. To understand why the Vikings were so intimidated by the Sami, one must first understand the land they inhabited and the extraordinary skills the Sami developed to thrive within it. The lands of the Sami are as beautiful as they are brutal. Imagine a vast expanse of tundra stretching endlessly, where snow and ice dominate for much of the year. Forests of pine and birch rise amidst frozen rivers, and the nights, particularly in the depths of winter, are long, dark, and frigid. The Arctic winds sweep relentlessly across the plains, carrying temperatures that can easily drop far below freezing. In the summer, these same lands transform into vibrant meadows and marshes, teeming with life, yet still unpredictable and demanding. Rivers swell with meltwater from snow-capped peaks, and swarms of insects can make life almost unbearable. The Sami learned to navigate these extremes with an intimate knowledge that bordered on instinct, understanding patterns in the weather, the behavior of animals, and the rhythms of the land itself. To the uninitiated Viking raider, accustomed to the more temperate forests and coasts of southern Scandinavia, the Sami lands must have seemed like a labyrinth of danger, a place where a single misstep could lead to disaster. Survival in these regions was never a matter of chance. Every aspect of Sami life was designed with endurance in mind, and every action was calculated to maintain balance with the environment. The Sami were reindeer herders, and the movements of their herds dictated much of their seasonal activity. Following these herds required meticulous planning, exceptional skill in tracking, and the ability to anticipate the harshness of winter storms. Reindeer were not merely animals to be hunted or domesticated. They were central to the Sami way of life, providing food, clothing, and materials for shelter. Understanding their behavior, knowing where to find them, and managing them sustainably was a task that required wisdom, patience, and an unparalleled connection to the land. The Vikings, who relied heavily on raids and direct confrontation, would have found themselves at a disadvantage against a people so attuned to the subtle movements of their environment. The Sami's dwellings reflected their nomadic and adaptive lifestyle. They lived in temporary structures, often tents made of reindeer hides stretched over wooden frames, designed to be dismantled and moved with the changing seasons. In some areas, more permanent structures were built, but these were always constructed with materials that the environment provided, ensuring minimal impact and maximum efficiency. Inside these shelters, the Sami maintained warmth and shelter from the relentless Arctic winds, using fire and insulation techniques that were simple yet extraordinarily effective. For a Viking accustomed to wooden longhouses or temporary campfires during raids, these dwellings might have seemed sparse, but they were masterpieces of practical engineering, perfectly suited to the challenges of the environment. The ability to move quickly, to disappear into the landscape, and to establish secure camps anywhere in the wilderness gave the Sami a tactical advantage that few outsiders could comprehend. Hunting and gathering were more than mere survival tactics. They were arts perfected over generations. The Sami hunted reindeer with incredible skill, using knowledge passed down orally from elders to younger generations. They understood the patterns of migration, the behavior of predators, and the subtle signs in the snow that indicated the presence of game. Fishing, too, was not left to chance. The Sami knew where rivers teemed with fish, how to craft nets and traps from local materials, and how to preserve food to survive the long, harsh winters. Even the gathering of berries, roots, and other edible plants was undertaken with careful observation and knowledge, ensuring that nothing was wasted. To the Vikings, who were skilled in raiding villages and confronting armies, the Sami's survivalist approach would have seemed like a secret magic, a mastery of life itself that could not be overpowered by weapons or numbers alone. Transportation and mobility were critical in the vast, often inaccessible terrain of the Sami lands. The Sami developed techniques to travel efficiently across snow and ice, using skis, sleds, and other tools that allowed them to cover great distances with speed and precision. Their knowledge of the terrain meant that they could move silently, set ambushes, and evade detection by intruders. This skill made them particularly dangerous to the Vikings, who relied on the element of surprise in their raids, but were not equipped for extended campaigns in frozen, treacherous landscapes. A Viking raider lost in the Arctic wilderness would quickly become vulnerable, exposed to both the elements and the strategic maneuvers of the Sami. In this environment, knowledge and skill were more valuable than brute strength, and the Sami had both in abundance. The spiritual life of the Sami further enhanced their aura of mystery and power. Unlike the Vikings, whose religious practices were centered around gods of war and conquest, the Sami had a spiritual connection that intertwined directly with the natural world. Shamans, or nomadic, held an important role within the community, acting as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual realms. They were believed to possess the ability to communicate with spirits, influence weather, heal illnesses, and guide the community in decisions critical to survival. These shamans were highly respected and sometimes feared, as their actions were thought to directly affect the well-being of the entire tribe. Viking accounts, filtered through oral traditions and sagas, often exaggerated these abilities, but the core of truth remained. The Sami had an understanding of the world and forces within it that Vikings found unsettling and incomprehensible. This spiritual dimension, combined with their tactical and environmental expertise, made them formidable opponents, not because of armies or weapons, but because they wielded knowledge and wisdom in ways the Vikings could not counter. The Sami also maintained a social structure that emphasized cooperation, resilience, and knowledge sharing. Life in the Arctic demanded collective effort. Survival was never a solitary pursuit. Communities worked together to hunt, herd, gather, and maintain shelters. Elders were respected for their wisdom and experience, and children were taught from a young age how to navigate the land, understand animal behavior, and respect the forces of nature. This social cohesion meant that the Sami could mobilize quickly and efficiently in response to threats. Unlike the Vikings, who often relied on aggression and intimidation, the Sami relied on strategy, foresight, and community coordination. To an outsider, these actions could appear coordinated yet invisible, almost like magic, reinforcing the sense that the Sami were untouchable within their own lands. The climate itself was both a weapon and a shield for the Sami. The winters were long, brutal, and unpredictable, with temperatures plunging far below freezing and snowstorms capable of isolating entire regions. Rivers froze and cracked unpredictably. Ice hidden beneath fresh snow could swallow a careless traveler, and blizzards could appear without warning, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The Sami understood these hazards intimately, able to predict weather patterns with astonishing accuracy and to use the terrain to their advantage. They could trap enemies, guide them into natural hazards, and navigate conditions that would have disoriented even the most experienced Viking navigator. In essence, the land itself became an ally, and the Sami its master. For the Vikings, who were accustomed to planning raids in environments they understood, this level of mastery over the natural world was both alien and terrifying. The Arctic was no longer just a setting, it was an active participant in the conflict, bending to the will of the Sami while frustrating those who sought to challenge them. Another factor that set the Sami apart was their knowledge of camouflage and stealth. They could move silently across snow-covered landscapes, leaving little trace of their presence. They could ambush enemies from hidden positions, striking quickly and disappearing before a counterattack could be mounted. Their clothing, crafted from reindeer hides and other natural materials, allowed them to blend seamlessly with the environment. This combination of mobility, stealth, and intimate terrain knowledge meant that even the legendary Viking warriors could find themselves outmaneuvered, trapped, or simply unable to locate their opponents. Historical accounts suggest that some Viking parties never returned from expeditions into the Sami lands, not because they were defeated in battle, but because they became lost, disoriented, or overwhelmed by conditions they could not control. In the sagas, these stories often took on a supernatural dimension, describing how entire groups vanished without a trace, further enhancing the mythos of the Sami as ghostly masters of the North. Trade and resource management also played a role in the Sami's power. While they were not empire builders in the traditional sense, they had knowledge of the land's resources that made them indispensable for survival in extreme conditions. They traded furs, hides, and other goods with neighboring peoples, creating networks of exchange that strengthened their communities and provided leverage against potential invaders. The Vikings, who often sought resources through raiding, would have recognized the value of these goods, but would also have realized the difficulty of acquiring them through force. The Sami's ability to live self-sufficiently while controlling access to critical resources gave them an economic and strategic edge, further discouraging would-be conquerors. Ultimately, the Sami's land was both a challenge and a shield, their knowledge a weapon, and their culture a source of strength. The Vikings, formidable in their own right, encountered a people who defied their expectations and their methods of warfare. The combination of harsh terrain, survival expertise, spiritual practices, social cohesion, and tactical mobility made the Sami uniquely capable of defending their homes without relying on the brute force that the Vikings knew so well. To outsiders, their actions often appeared inexplicable, their successes almost magical. But beneath the surface, it was simply a matter of preparation, understanding, and respect for the natural and spiritual laws that governed life in the Arctic. In the end, the Sami people and their land represent a remarkable story of adaptation, resilience, and ingenuity. They turned what many would consider inhospitable and unforgiving terrain into a home, a fortress, and a center of culture that could withstand the intrusion of some of history's most feared warriors. The Vikings, despite their reputation for fearlessness and conquest, came to recognize the Sami as a force beyond their comprehension, a people who wielded knowledge, skill, and environmental mastery as effectively as any sword. The legend of the Sami, their lands, and their ability to thrive where others faltered, continues to captivate the imagination, a testament to the enduring power of human ingenuity, courage, and harmony with the natural world. Even the fiercest warriors can be unsettled by forces they do not understand, and the Vikings, whose name is synonymous with fear and dominance across medieval Europe, were no exception. They had faced countless armies, defended against well-fortified settlements, and raided distant lands with ruthless efficiency. They had seen men fight with reckless abandon, witnessed the horrors of combat in every conceivable form, and yet, when they encountered the Sami, they faced a kind of fear unlike anything they had experienced before. This was not merely a fear born of the prospect of physical defeat, though the Sami were capable warriors in their own right, nor was it fear based on unfamiliar terrain alone, though the frozen expanses of the Arctic were certainly daunting. The fear the Vikings felt was something deeper, more primal. It was the fear of the unknown, of a power that could not be measured in swords or shields, a power rooted in the Sami's mastery of both the natural and spiritual worlds. To understand why the Sami terrified the Vikings, one must first consider the nature of fear itself, particularly in a society like the Vikings. The Norsemen were fearless in the sense that they were willing to risk death for glory, wealth, or revenge. They believed in the valor of battle and the inevitability of fate, concepts embodied in their worship of gods like Odin, the god of wisdom and war, and Thor, the god of thunder and protection. Yet, even within this culture of fearless confrontation, there existed a profound respect, and sometimes dread, for the mystical, the inexplicable, and the unpredictable. The Vikings recognized that human courage could not conquer every challenge, that there were forces in the world beyond human control, and it was in this space between the known and the unknowable that the Sami operated with uncanny effectiveness. The Sami were not mere warriors. They were masters of psychological strategy, of perception, and of the manipulation of both environment and mind. They understood that fear could be a weapon as lethal as any sword. Whereas the Vikings relied on intimidation through sheer numbers, aggressive tactics, and the terror of sudden raids, the Sami employed subtle, almost invisible methods to unsettle and dominate their enemies. One of the most potent aspects of this psychological warfare was their use of stealth and camouflage. In a landscape dominated by snow, ice, and forests, the Sami could move without leaving a trace, blending seamlessly with their surroundings. Their clothing, crafted from reindeer hides and dyed using natural substances, allowed them to disappear into the wintry landscape. The Vikings, accustomed to encountering opponents who could be seen, tracked, and confronted, suddenly found themselves facing invisible adversaries, a phenomenon that inspired both awe and dread. Stealth alone, however, would not have been enough to instill the deep, lingering fear recorded in the sagas. It was the combination of stealth with knowledge of the environment that made the Sami so formidable. They could predict the movements of their enemies, anticipate their strategies, and manipulate the very land to their advantage. Snowstorms, icy rivers, and treacherous terrain became instruments of defense under their command. The Sami had an almost preternatural understanding of the Arctic environment, able to interpret subtle shifts in the weather, read the tracks of animals and humans alike, and determine the safest and deadly routes through their territory. To the Vikings, who were skilled navigators and raiders, but not experts in Arctic survival, this expertise was terrifying. One wrong move in the frozen expanse could lead to disaster, and the Sami seemed to have the uncanny ability to guide outsiders exactly into those dangers, all while remaining undetected themselves. Adding to this mastery of the physical realm was the Sami's profound engagement with the spiritual. The Vikings were not strangers to religion, ritual, or superstition. They understood the influence of omens, the power of sacrifice, and the importance of divine favor. But the Sami's spiritual practices were deeply intertwined with the natural world in ways that challenged even the Norse understanding of magic and ritual. Central to this spiritual power were the Noidi, the shamans of the Sami people, who served as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual realms. These individuals were believed to possess the ability to communicate with spirits, summon protective forces, curse enemies, and influence natural phenomena. Viking accounts, as recorded in sagas and oral histories, often describe events that seem almost supernatural: sudden blizzards that obliterated entire raiding parties, ghostly figures moving silently across snow-covered plains, and enemies disappearing without a trace. While the exact nature of these events may have been embellished over time, they reflect a genuine fear that the Vikings experienced when facing a people whose spiritual and tactical capabilities were beyond comprehension. The Noidi were not merely ritual specialists, they were strategic assets. In a society that relied heavily on practical knowledge and adaptability for survival, these shamans could provide guidance on timing, routes, and tactics. They could read signs in the weather, interpret the behavior of animals, and foresee dangers invisible to others. To the Vikings, these abilities seemed almost prophetic, a form of preternatural intelligence that turned the Arctic landscape itself into a weapon. A snowstorm could appear at the exact moment a raiding party attempted to navigate treacherous terrain. A river might break underfoot at the precise moment of crossing, and the Sami could vanish from view, leaving the Vikings disoriented, frightened, and vulnerable. The line between skill and magic was blurred, and for the Vikings, this ambiguity was terrifying. Legends from the Viking sagas recount multiple encounters that illustrate this fear. One such story tells of a group of Vikings attempting to raid a Sami village during the height of winter. The Norsemen, confident in their superior numbers and weaponry, were surprised to find the village seemingly empty, the inhabitants nowhere in sight. As they advanced, the snowstorm thickened unnaturally, obscuring visibility and making navigation nearly impossible. The Vikings reported hearing sounds, footsteps in the snow, voices carried on the wind, but when they followed them, there was nothing there. In some versions of the story, wolves or reindeer appeared to move unnaturally, guiding the invaders into perilous terrain or acting as extensions of the Sami's will. By the time the Vikings realized the impossibility of their situation, they were already lost, trapped in an environment that their skill and courage could not overcome. They retreated in confusion, shaken to the core, and the story of their encounter spread, enhancing the reputation of the Sami as ghostly, formidable adversaries. This reputation was reinforced by the Sami's use of psychological tactics that capitalized on the Vikings' expectations and fears. The Vikings, accustomed to open battlefields or direct raids, were ill-prepared for ambushes in a landscape they could not read. The Sami would often create illusions of presence or absence, setting traps that relied on perception as much as on physical danger. They could manipulate tracks in the snow, create decoys, or even use animal behavior to mislead their enemies. These methods sowed confusion and doubt, leading the Vikings to question not only their immediate safety, but also the reliability of their own senses. Fear, after all, is amplified by uncertainty, and the Sami were masters at exploiting the unknown. Moreover, the Sami's ability to survive in the extreme north contributed to the Vikings' fear. These raiders, who had conquered lands across Europe and were accustomed to imposing their will through force, found themselves at a disadvantage in the Arctic. While the Vikings might have been better equipped in terms of armor and weaponry, the Sami had endurance, adaptability, and intimate knowledge of every hill, river, and snowdrift. The harsh climate was no obstacle to them. It was a familiar ally. When battles or confrontations of any kind occurred, the Sami could retreat strategically, lure enemies into dangerous terrain, or strike with precision and then vanish. The Vikings, by contrast, were exposed to the elements, slowed by snow and ice, and increasingly aware of their vulnerability. What they faced was not just a people, but a living, breathing environment turned against them, orchestrated with intelligence and subtlety by the Sami. the cultural differences between the two groups also amplified this fear. The Vikings were warriors who valued conquest, treasure, and reputation, while the Sami valued survival, balance, and harmony with the natural world. This fundamental divergence meant that the Vikings could not predict or anticipate the Sami's actions based on their own experience. Where the Vikings might expect resistance, they found evasion. Where they expected surrender, they found resilience. Where they expected a battle, they often encountered silence and disappearance. The unpredictability of the Sami's tactics, combined with their skill and spiritual influence, created a sense of helplessness in the Vikings that was more terrifying than any physical confrontation. Stories of supernatural occurrences further reinforced the fear. Sagas recount tales of Viking ships lost in Arctic waters, of men disappearing in snowstorms, and of warriors pursued by entities that seemed neither human nor animal. While modern historians understand that many of these accounts were likely exaggerated or symbolic, they reflect the profound psychological impact of encountering the Sami. To the Vikings, who valued strength and bravery, being maneuvered, mystified, and haunted by forces beyond understanding was a source of deep, abiding terror. The Sami, through skill, strategy, and cultural knowledge, had created an aura of invincibility that no weapon could penetrate and no number of warriors could overwhelm. Even beyond the immediate physical and spiritual challenges, the Sami instilled fear through reputation. News of failed Viking raids, of lost expeditions, and of inexplicable phenomena spread quickly throughout Norse communities. The mere mention of the ghosts of the North, as some Vikings reportedly referred to the Sami, was enough to deter raiders, or at least make them approach with extreme caution. Legends describe the Sami as a people who could appear and vanish at will, summon storms, and strike with unerring accuracy, all while remaining untouched. The psychological impact of these stories cannot be overstated. For a culture that prided itself on fearlessness and martial prowess, the realization that there existed people they could not easily confront was both humbling and frightening. In the end, the Sami terrified the Vikings not because they wielded superior swords or armor, nor because they had overwhelming numbers, but because they represented an entirely different paradigm of power. Their mastery of the environment, their spiritual influence, their use of stealth and deception, and their ability to survive and thrive under conditions that would crush outsiders, created a force that the Vikings could neither easily understand nor combat. The fear was both practical and psychological, rooted in real danger but magnified by the unknown and the mysterious. It was a fear that lingered long after the encounter ended, a legacy carried forward in stories, sagas, and historical memory. The Vikings, despite their reputation for unparalleled bravery, came to recognize that the Sami were a force unto themselves, capable of confronting and confounding even the most skilled warriors. The Arctic land, the spiritual practices, the strategic genius, and the resilience of the Sami combined to create an enemy that could not be conquered in conventional terms. They turned their environment into a weapon, their knowledge into an advantage, and their culture into a shield. In the annals of history, the Sami stand as a testament to the power of intelligence, strategy, and harmony with nature, a reminder that even the most feared warriors in history could encounter people who were truly unconquerable. The history of human conflict is not just the story of battles and victories. It is also the story of fear, legend, and the way stories shape perception. Among the many peoples who inspired awe and trepidation, the Sami stand out not merely for their survival skills or mastery of the harsh Arctic, but for the stories and legends that grew around them, stories that would haunt the minds of Vikings long after their expeditions into the frozen north. The Vikings, who had terrorized much of Europe with their raids and battle prowess, encountered a force so different, so enigmatic, and so intimately connected to the environment that the resulting tales transformed their perception of power and fear. These stories were not merely tales of combat. They were narratives that illustrated the ways in which the Sami used knowledge, strategy, and psychological ingenuity to create an almost supernatural reputation that lingered through generations. The Viking sagas, though often exaggerated or romanticized over time, provide glimpses into the encounters that inspired these legends. One such story tells of a Viking expedition, perhaps a raiding party sent north in search of wealth or resources, who ventured into Sami territory in the dead of winter. The landscape was dominated by snow-covered plains, frozen rivers, and dense forests that obscured vision and slowed progress. The Vikings, confident in their numbers and weapons, expected to confront a settlement in the same way they had conquered countless villages in the south. But the Sami, adept at evasion and concealment, had anticipated their arrival. Villages appeared empty, tracks were carefully masked or misleading, and the warriors themselves moved like shadows through the blizzard. The Vikings reported disorientation, a sense of being watched, an eerie silence broken only by the distant howling of wolves or the rustling of reindeer. By the time the Norsemen realized that they were being subtly herded, misled, and manipulated through the terrain, panic had set in, and the retreat was executed with a mixture of fear and respect. The role of environment in these tales cannot be overstated. Unlike the familiar landscapes of the forests and rivers of southern Scandinavia, the Arctic lands of the Sami were alien to the Vikings. Rivers that froze unexpectedly, hidden crevices in the ice, and sudden snowstorms created a landscape in which the uninitiated could easily become trapped or lost. The Sami exploited these conditions to their advantage, using their intimate knowledge to lead enemies into natural hazards or to disappear from view entirely. In one account, a Viking party attempted to cross what they believed was stable ice over a frozen river, only for the surface to collapse beneath them. They were forced to retreat hastily, and those who survived returned with stories of invisible adversaries who had guided them into danger. The sagas describe such events in almost mythical terms, with the Sami portrayed as ghostly figures who moved with preternatural speed and awareness. For the Vikings, these experiences were terrifying not merely because of the physical danger, but because they defied the expectations and understanding of seasoned warriors. Ambushes were another critical aspect of the Sami strategy, and they became central to the legends. The Vikings were accustomed to open combat or direct raids, but the Sami used the terrain to their advantage, striking quickly and disappearing without a trace. Trees, snowdrifts, and shadows became allies in these encounters. The Vikings reported being surrounded without realizing it, hearing the faintest of sounds, a crunch in the snow, a snapped twig, and suddenly being under attack. These tactics were designed to create confusion, panic, and a sense of helplessness. Even if no permanent harm was inflicted, the psychological impact was profound. A raiding party that felt constantly observed, misled, or haunted would inevitably make mistakes, retreat prematurely, or abandon missions entirely. In this way, the Sami achieved strategic victories without direct confrontation, reinforcing their fearsome reputation. The supernatural dimension of these tales further amplified the terror. In many sagas, the Sami were said to possess powers that went beyond human understanding. They were able to summon storms at will, call upon spirits of the land and animals, and even appear to vanish into thin air. One story recounts a Viking party pursuing a group of Sami hunters through a forested plain. As night fell, a sudden blizzard obscured the landscape, and the Vikings could no longer see their targets. In the morning, the Sami were gone, and the Norsemen found themselves disoriented, separated from their companions, and surrounded by treacherous terrain. Wolves, reindeer, and the sound of voices carried by the wind created an impression that the Sami were everywhere at once, striking and vanishing according to a plan only they understood. These tales, while likely embellished, reflect the genuine fear inspired by the Sami's ability to manipulate perception, using both environment and psychological tactics to assert dominance without open battle. Viking accounts also describe encounters in which entire expeditions seemed to vanish. Groups sent north for raiding or reconnaissance sometimes returned with only a handful of survivors, who recounted experiences that bordered on the surreal. They spoke of villages that appeared deserted one moment and full of armed warriors the next, of paths that twisted inexplicably, and of spectral figures moving through snow-laden forests. In the sagas, these figures were often described as ghostly or otherworldly, leading to the moniker Ghosts of the North for the Sami. To the Vikings, whose identity was built on courage, conquest, and reputation, being outmaneuvered in such a manner was both humiliating and frightening. The stories reinforced the notion that the Sami were not merely physically capable, but possessed an almost supernatural mastery of their environment and their enemies' minds. These tales also emphasize the Sami's strategic patience and restraint. Unlike other societies that might respond to an invasion with immediate aggression, the Sami often used deception and avoidance to gain advantage. Retreat was not a sign of weakness, it was a calculated tactic. By drawing their enemies into unfamiliar and dangerous terrain, confusing them through misdirection, and using weather and environment to create hazards, the Sami could inflict defeat without direct confrontation. Viking sagas describe instances in which raiding parties retreated in frustration, bewildered by the invisible strategies of their foes. In some accounts, the Vikings spoke of the Sami as if they were orchestrating the land itself, bending snowstorms, frozen rivers, and forests to their will. This perception, whether entirely accurate or embellished, contributed to a legendary status that spread throughout Norse communities. Animal behavior played a role in the legends as well. Wolves, reindeer, and other native wildlife were not merely part of the environment, but were seen as extensions of the Sami's influence. Wolves could appear to lead intruders into traps. Reindeer could seem to vanish and reappear in strategic locations, and birds or other signs in nature were interpreted as warnings or guides. To a Viking unfamiliar with Arctic ecology, these events would appear mysterious or even magical. Stories describe raiders following tracks that seemed to shift or disappear, hearing cries or movements that had no visible source, and encountering animals in ways that defied normal understanding. These tales added to the perception that the Sami had powers beyond the physical, blending practical survival techniques with an aura of supernatural influence. The legends also highlight the Sami's cunning use of fire, light, and sound. During nighttime or twilight, small fires could be set strategically to mislead, confuse, or intimidate raiders. Sounds could be manipulated to suggest movement where there was none, creating the impression of larger forces or ghostly presences. The Vikings, accustomed to interpreting such signs literally, often found themselves deceived, believing that the Sami were present in far greater numbers than they actually were. These techniques were subtle but effective, shaping the psychological battlefield as much as the physical one. Over time, these stories were repeated and embellished, creating a cultural memory of the Sami as elusive, omnipresent, and almost supernatural adversaries. Even in encounters that did not involve direct combat, the Sami's reputation for cunning and resourcefulness contributed to fear. Vikings attempting to negotiate or trade often found themselves at a disadvantage, as the Sami could control access to vital resources like reindeer, furs, and routes through the wilderness. This economic leverage combined with their environmental mastery, meant that the Sami could exert influence without force, reinforcing the perception that they were untouchable. The legends, therefore, are not only about battle, but about a comprehensive form of dominance, encompassing terrain, resources, psychology, and cultural perception. The cumulative effect of these encounters, both real and legendary, was a pervasive sense of awe and fear. Viking communities far removed from the Arctic North heard stories of raiding parties that never returned, of expeditions thwarted by invisible adversaries, and of warriors who could strike and vanish at will. These tales were passed orally, becoming part of the larger tapestry of Viking culture and lore. They served not only as cautionary tales, but as affirmations of the limits of Viking power, emphasizing that there were lands and peoples beyond their control, places where their skill and bravery could be rendered ineffective. The Sami became, in the collective imagination of the Vikings, the ultimate enigma, a people who could survive, thrive, and dominate in ways that defied conventional understanding. In modern terms, many of these tales can be explained by the Sami's intimate knowledge of terrain, weather, and survival, combined with deliberate tactical choices. Snowstorms, ice hazards, ambushes, and stealth could easily create situations that seemed miraculous or ghostly to outsiders. Yet the fear they inspired in the Vikings was genuine, and the legends reflect the psychological impact of facing an enemy whose methods were entirely alien. The Sami did not need to overwhelm their opponents with sheer force. They created conditions in which the Vikings' own assumptions, expectations, and sense of control were constantly undermined. This form of psychological warfare, grounded in environmental mastery and cultural ingenuity, ensured that the Sami were remembered not only as survivors, but as ghostly masters of the North. Through these stories, we also glimpse the cultural differences that shaped Viking perceptions. The Sami valued balance, survival, and spiritual connection, while the Vikings valued conquest, treasure, and martial prowess. This divergence meant that Viking strategies, successful elsewhere, were often ineffective in Sami territory. The legends, therefore, are not just about fear, but about a clash of worldviews, one built on domination and aggression, the other on adaptability, knowledge, and subtle control. The myths of the Sami's ghostly presence, their magical abilities, and their tactical genius are a reflection of this fundamental difference. In conclusion, the tales and legends surrounding the Sami and their encounters with the Vikings are some of the most compelling examples of how history, perception, and narrative intertwine. They illustrate a people whose skills, knowledge, and ingenuity created a legendary reputation that transcended physical combat. Through ambushes, environmental mastery, spiritual practices, and psychological tactics, the Sami instilled a level of fear and respect that few warriors in history ever experienced. The Vikings, despite their fearsome reputation, learned to approach the Arctic with caution, often retreating or avoiding confrontation altogether. The stories of these encounters became woven into the fabric of Norse culture, ensuring that the legacy of the Sami as the ghosts of the North endured for generations, a testament to the enduring power of strategy, knowledge, and the human mind in the shaping of history. The legacy of the Sami people is a story that extends far beyond the frozen tundras and snow-covered forests of the Arctic North. It is a legacy built on resilience, ingenuity, and a profound understanding of a harsh and unforgiving environment, a legacy that left an indelible mark not only on the history of their own lands, but also on the Vikings, the formidable warriors of the medieval North. While the Vikings are often celebrated for their exploration, their raids, and their martial prowess. Their encounters with the Sami revealed that there existed a people who could challenge even the most feared warriors through knowledge, strategy, and a deep connection to the natural and spiritual world. The Sami's ability to survive, adapt, and thrive in some of the harshest conditions on Earth created a cultural and historical impact that resonates through time, offering lessons about courage, intelligence, and the power of harmony with the environment. To appreciate the Sami legacy, one must first understand the context in which they lived. The Arctic North is not a forgiving place. Winters are long and brutal, stretching for months with temperatures plunging far below freezing. Snowstorms can arise suddenly, ice can crack without warning, and daylight is fleeting during the depths of winter. The Sami learned to read these conditions with extraordinary precision. Every shift in the wind, the movement of clouds, the subtle behavior of animals, and the texture of the snow could indicate what lay ahead. This knowledge was not acquired overnight. It was honed over generations, passed down orally from elders to children, forming a continuous chain of wisdom that allowed the community to endure. Unlike societies that rely on fortifications or armies for security, the Sami relied on understanding, adaptability, and mobility. Their mastery over such a challenging environment became a defining element of their identity and ultimately a source of fear and respect for those who attempted to intrude upon their territory. One of the most profound aspects of the Sami legacy is their strategic and tactical sophistication. The Vikings, with their reputation for aggression and conquest, often relied on speed, surprise, and numerical superiority to overwhelm opponents. In contrast, the Sami employed strategies that leveraged their deep knowledge of the land, their mobility, and their ability to manipulate perception. Ambushes, evasion, and the careful use of natural hazards allowed them to achieve tactical victories without the need for large-scale battles. The stories of snowstorms appearing at critical moments, of hidden ice traps, or of villages vanishing into the landscape may sound like myth, but they reflect a consistent pattern of using environmental mastery to protect the community and outmaneuver adversaries. This approach required patience, intelligence, and foresight, qualities that contributed significantly to the Sami's enduring reputation. The spiritual dimension of Sami culture further enhanced their influence and legacy. The nomadic, or shamans, played a critical role in maintaining harmony between the community, the land, and the supernatural forces believed to inhabit it. These spiritual leaders could perform rituals to ensure successful hunts, protect the community from harm, and maintain balance within the environment. For the Vikings, encountering individuals who could seemingly control natural phenomena, summon spirits, or foretell outcomes was deeply unsettling. While the historical accuracy of supernatural claims may be debated, the impact on Viking perception was real. The psychological effect of facing an enemy whose abilities could not be fully understood or predicted reinforced the Sami's legendary status, embedding their mystique into the cultural memory of the region. The Sami's mastery of mobility and adaptation was equally significant. Unlike societies tied to fixed settlements, the Sami were semi-nomadic, following the seasonal migration patterns of reindeer herds, which were central to their sustenance and livelihood. This mobility allowed them to avoid unnecessary confrontation, exploit natural resources efficiently, and maintain a degree of unpredictability that confounded invaders. For the Vikings, accustomed to raiding villages, fortresses, and more sedentary populations, this mobility was disorienting. They could not rely on conventional tactics because the Sami could appear and disappear at will, striking with precision and then retreating into the vast, uncharted wilderness. The ability to navigate and manipulate such terrain was a hallmark of the Sami legacy, demonstrating that intelligence, flexibility, and environmental awareness could rival even the most formidable military power. Another crucial element of the Sami legacy lies in their sustainable relationship with the natural world. While the Vikings often sought to conquer, exploit, and extract resources from the lands they encountered, the Sami understood the importance of balance. Their practices of hunting, fishing, and herding were sustainable and attuned to the rhythms of nature. Reindeer herding, in particular, was not simply an economic activity. It was a sophisticated system of knowledge involving animal behavior, seasonal cycles, and ecological management. This approach ensured long-term survival and resilience in a region where mismanagement could easily lead to catastrophe. The Vikings, who often viewed the Arctic lands through the lens of conquest, would have recognized the difficulty of surviving without such intimate understanding, further enhancing their respect and fear of the Sami. Trade and resource management also played a role in the Sami's enduring influence. While they were not empire builders or conquerors, they controlled access to critical resources such as reindeer, furs, and knowledge of safe passage through the wilderness. This gave them leverage over neighboring peoples, including Viking traders and raiders. The Sami could engage in commerce on their own terms, providing goods, guidance, or protection in exchange for alliances or goods that supported their communities. This economic strategy, combined with environmental mastery and strategic skill, reinforced their position as an influential and respected people, capable of shaping interactions with outsiders without relying on direct conflict. Cultural resilience is another hallmark of the Sami legacy. Despite centuries of contact with Vikings, later Scandinavian states, and other external pressures, the Sami maintained their language, traditions, and spiritual practices. This resilience reflects a broader theme of adaptability and identity preservation in the face of adversity. The same qualities that allowed them to survive and thrive in the Arctic: knowledge, flexibility, and community cohesion also enabled them to withstand the pressures of external influence. Their continued cultural presence today, including language revitalization efforts, traditional reindeer herding, and the practice of inspired spiritual traditions, attests to a legacy that has endured far beyond the Viking age. The psychological impact of the Sami on the Vikings cannot be overstated, and it forms an essential part of their legacy. Stories of Viking expeditions lost in the Arctic, of raiding parties retreating in confusion, and of warriors encountering seemingly supernatural adversaries created a lasting impression of the Sami as both cunning and untouchable. The moniker Ghosts of the North reflects not just fear, but an acknowledgement of skill, strategy, and mastery that was respected even by those who considered themselves invincible. This perception influenced Viking behavior, encouraging caution, respect, and sometimes avoidance of the Arctic regions altogether. The legacy of instilling fear through intelligence, strategy, and environmental mastery is as significant as any physical conquest, demonstrating that influence can be achieved through subtlety, knowledge, and psychological prowess, rather than brute force alone. Education and knowledge transmission were also central to Sami resilience and legacy. Skills for survival, tracking, herding, navigation, and spiritual practice were taught through oral tradition, observation, and apprenticeship. Every child learned the intricacies of reading snow and ice, interpreting animal behavior, and understanding seasonal patterns. This ensured that knowledge accumulated over generations was preserved, refined, and applied effectively. Viking observers noted the efficiency, skill, and sophistication of the Sami's methods, recognizing that these abilities were cultivated deliberately and with purpose. This emphasis on knowledge transmission contributed to the longevity of the Sami cultural and strategic advantage, allowing them to maintain their influence across centuries despite external pressures. The legacy of the Sami also challenges common narratives about power and warfare. In a world often dominated by the equation of strength and numbers, the Sami demonstrated that mastery of environment, psychology, and culture could rival or exceed conventional military might. Their encounters with the Vikings illustrate a broader principle that adaptability, intelligence, and harmonious coexistence with the environment can create forms of power that are not easily measured by swords, armor, or armies. The fear they inspired in the Vikings was therefore not incidental. It was the natural outcome of a people whose approach to life, survival, and conflict was fundamentally different yet profoundly effective. Moreover, the Sami's influence extended beyond immediate encounters with Vikings. Their mastery of Arctic survival informed trade, navigation, and exploration in later centuries. Scandinavian societies, while eventually consolidating control over northern territories, could not replicate the Sami's intimate understanding of the land. Even modern explorers and settlers in the Arctic relied on knowledge and techniques that were rooted in Sami practices, demonstrating the enduring practical impact of their wisdom. This blending of cultural influence, practical skill, and strategic insight reinforces the argument that the Sami's legacy is both historical and ongoing, shaping interactions with the northern environment across centuries. The myths and legends surrounding the Sami, particularly in Viking sagas, further cement their place in historical memory. By appearing as elusive, strategic, and almost supernatural figures, the Sami became more than a tribe. They became symbols of resilience, intelligence, and mastery over a harsh environment. These narratives served multiple purposes. They preserved knowledge of survival tactics, conveyed moral and practical lessons about caution and respect, and reinforced the awe inspired by those capable of thriving in extreme conditions. The interplay of history and legend ensured that the Sami's reputation endured long after direct contact with Viking raiders diminished, creating a cultural and historical footprint that remains significant today. Even in contemporary times, the Sami legacy can be traced in the ongoing cultural, spiritual, and ecological practices of their communities. Reindeer herding, environmental stewardship, spiritual ceremonies, and traditional crafts continue to embody the principles that once allowed them to confront and intimidate Viking invaders. Modern recognition of Sami rights, land use, and cultural preservation reflects an acknowledgement of their enduring significance, both as a historical people and as a living culture. Their influence on the northern regions of Scandinavia continues to shape perceptions, policy, and cultural identity, illustrating that the legacy forged through centuries of resilience and ingenuity has not only endured but remains relevant. In the final analysis, the Sami's impact on Viking history and the broader historical narrative is profound. By combining environmental mastery, strategic acumen, spiritual authority, psychological insight, and cultural resilience, they created a form of influence that rivaled even the most powerful raiding parties of their time. The fear they inspired in the Vikings was not merely a reflection of physical threat, but of the impossibility of easily comprehending or overcoming their methods. Their legacy serves as a testament to the power of knowledge, adaptability, and harmonious existence with the natural world, demonstrating that true influence can emerge from intelligence, strategy, and resilience rather than sheer force. The story of the Sami, their lands, and their encounters with the Vikings reminds us that history is shaped not only by the victories of warriors, but also by the wisdom of those who understand, anticipate, and adapt. It teaches that courage is not defined solely by confrontation, but by mastery of one's environment, careful planning, and the ability to outthink adversaries. The Sami legacy is therefore enduring, not only as a historical record, but as a living example of how human ingenuity, perseverance, and respect for the forces of nature can create legends, inspire fear, and leave an indelible mark on the course of history. As we reach the final chapter of the story of the Sami and their encounters with the Vikings, it becomes clear that the narrative is not simply one of confrontation or survival. It is a tale that weaves together elements of history, culture, psychology, and the extraordinary capacity of humans to adapt, endure, and master even the harshest of environments. The Sami were more than a tribe. They were a living testament to resilience, intelligence, and the profound influence of harmony with nature. Their story, preserved through sagas, legends, and historical memory, transcends the bounds of conventional warfare and provides a broader lesson about power, strategy, and human ingenuity. When the Vikings, who had conquered vast swaths of Europe, came face to face with the Sami, they encountered a form of mastery that could not be measured by numbers, weapons, or aggression alone. This encounter left an enduring impression not only on those who lived through it, but on the generations that followed, cementing the Sami's place in history as a people whose strength was both subtle and formidable. The Sami's ability to instill fear in the Vikings was rooted in several interrelated factors, each of which amplified the others. First and foremost was their unmatched understanding of their environment. The Arctic North is an unforgiving landscape where survival demands constant vigilance, adaptability, and a profound connection to the rhythms of nature. The Sami mastered these challenges through generations of observation, practice, and oral knowledge transmission. Every snowdrift, frozen river, forested plain, and hidden ravine was mapped not on paper, but in the collective memory of the community. They could predict weather shifts, track animals, and navigate seemingly impossible terrain with ease. To the Vikings, who relied on conventional navigation and brute force, this mastery seemed almost supernatural. The Arctic environment itself became a weapon in the hands of the Sami, a means of controlling, deceiving, and outmaneuvering their formidable adversaries. Coupled with environmental mastery was the Sami's skill in psychological warfare. They understood that fear is often more powerful than physical force and employed strategies designed to manipulate perception, sow confusion, and destabilize intruders. Ambushes were executed with precision, tracks in the snow could be altered to mislead, and sounds or movements in the forest were exploited to create illusions,